What would you do if the person who murdered your child had been welcomed into your home, shared meals at your table, and slept under your roof? What if that person wasn't a stranger, wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, but someone you called a friend? Someone you trusted with the most precious thing in your life? On August 20, 2016, in a small Minnesota town of just 1,000 residents, a 5-year-old girl named Alayna Jeanne Ertl went to sleep wrapped in her favorite pink Princess Elsa blanket from the movie Frozen. She never woke up. And the man responsible? He was downstairs. He was a family friend. He was her father's coworker. He was someone they'd invited into their lives without a second thought. This is the story of how trust became a weapon, how a community was shattered, and how one little girl's death exposed a predator who had been hiding in plain sight for an entire decade. Before we go any further into Alayna's story, I need you to do something. If you believe that cases like this deserve to be told, that victims deserve to have their stories heard, and that communities need to know the warning signs of predators hiding among us, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a like on this video so the algorithm pushes this story to more people who need to hear it. And comment below with your thoughts, your questions, or even just to let me know you're here standing with Alayna's family. Your engagement isn't just numbers to me. It's how we keep these stories alive. It's how we honor the victims. Now let's dive deep into what happened on that terrible night in Minnesota. The town where Alayna Jeanne Ertl lived was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. With a population hovering around 1,000 people, this wasn't the kind of community where you could be anonymous. Your neighbors knew your name. They knew your kids. They knew where you worked, where you went to church, and what you did on Friday nights. It was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked, where children played outside until the streetlights came on, where trust wasn't something you had to earn because everyone assumed they already knew who you were dealing with. But just months before Alayna's death, this tight-knit community had already been tested in ways that no small town should ever have to endure. A devastating tornado had ripped through their quiet streets, tearing apart homes, destroying businesses, and leaving families scrambling to rebuild not just their houses but their sense of security. The community had rallied together, as small towns do. Neighbors helped neighbors. Strangers became friends. And in the aftermath of that natural disaster, the bonds between people grew even stronger. Or so they thought. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that while they were rebuilding their homes and their lives, a predator was moving among them. Someone who understood exactly how to exploit trust. Someone who knew how to blend in, how to be the friendly coworker, the reliable softball teammate, the guy you could count on for a good time at the local bar. Someone who had been perfecting his mask for years. Zachary Todd Anderson was 25 years old in August of 2016. He worked at the same place as Alayna's father. Every Friday night, like clockwork, he played softball with Alayna's dad and a group of other guys from around town. It was a tradition, the kind of small-town ritual that builds friendships and creates bonds. After the games, they'd sometimes grab drinks at the local bar, talking about work, about life, about nothing in particular and everything at once. Anderson had been to the Jeanne Ertl home multiple times. He wasn't a stranger who had to be introduced or explained. He was just Zach. The guy from work. The softball buddy. The friend who sometimes crashed on the couch after a late night of drinking because it was easier than driving home. Alayna's parents had no reason to question his presence in their home. Why would they? He'd been there before. He'd never given them any reason to worry. He was part of their circle, part of their community, part of their lives. And that's exactly what made him so dangerous. On the evening of August 19, 2016, Anderson had been out drinking with Alayna's parents. They'd spent time at the local bar, laughing, joking, making plans for future softball games. It was a normal night, the kind of night they'd had countless times before. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Nothing raised any red flags. When the night wound down and it became clear that Anderson had been drinking too much to drive safely home, Alayna's parents did what they'd done before. They invited him to stay the night. It seemed like the responsible thing to do. It seemed like what friends did for friends. It seemed like the right choice. But it would turn out to be the most devastating decision they would ever make. The Jeanne family went to bed that night with no concerns, no worries, no sense that anything was wrong. Alayna was tucked into her bed upstairs, surrounded by the comfort of her favorite things. Her pink Princess Elsa blanket from Frozen was pulled up around her. She was 5 years old, in that beautiful age where imagination and reality blend together, where princesses seem real and the world still feels safe and magical. She had no concept of danger, no understanding that there were people in the world who could hurt her. Why would she? She was protected. She was loved. She was in her own home with her family just down the hall. And downstairs, Anderson was settling in for the night. Or that's what everyone thought. What happened in the early morning hours of August 20th remains one of the most horrifying betrayals of trust that this small Minnesota town had ever witnessed. While Alayna's parents slept, trusting that their daughter was safe in her own bedroom, trusting that their friend downstairs would do nothing more than sleep off his drinks and head home in the morning, Anderson made his way upstairs. He knew the layout of the house. He'd been there before. He knew exactly where Alayna's bedroom was located. He knew the family's routines, their habits, when they slept soundly and when they might stir. He had all the information he needed because he'd been given access, given trust, given the benefit of the doubt that friends give to friends. And he used all of that knowledge to commit an act so heinous, so unthinkable, that even hardened law enforcement officers would later struggle to process what had happened. The details of what Anderson did to Alayna that night are difficult to discuss, but they're important to understand because they reveal the true nature of the person who had been hiding behind the mask of friendship. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This wasn't something that just happened in the heat of the moment. This was calculated. This was intentional. This was the act of someone who had been thinking about doing something like this, who had been planning, who had been waiting for the right opportunity. Anderson sexually assaulted 5-year-old Alayna Jeanne in her own bedroom while her parents slept just down the hall. The little girl who had gone to sleep feeling safe and protected, wrapped in her favorite blanket, became the victim of a violent predator who had been welcomed into her home. The trauma of that assault was so severe that Alayna began to cry out. She was in pain. She was terrified. She was calling for her parents, for someone, for anyone to help her. And Anderson, realizing that her cries might wake her parents, made another choice. A choice that would transform this case from a horrifying sexual assault into a homicide. A choice that would end a 5-year-old girl's life before it had really even begun. To silence Alayna's cries, Anderson suffocated her. He placed his hand over her mouth and nose, cutting off her air supply, holding it there as she struggled, as her small body fought for oxygen, as her life slipped away. The medical examiner would later determine that Alayna died from asphyxiation. She died alone, in pain, terrified, unable to understand why this was happening to her, unable to call out for her mommy and daddy who were so close but couldn't hear her final moments. And when it was over, when Alayna's small body had gone still, when there was no more struggling, no more fighting, no more life left in that little girl, Anderson left her there in her bedroom. He went back downstairs. And he went to sleep. Let that sink in for a moment. After sexually assaulting and murdering a 5-year-old child, after taking the life of an innocent little girl who had done nothing wrong, who had simply been sleeping in her own bed in her own home, Anderson was able to lie down and go to sleep. No immediate confession. No breakdown. No rush to leave the scene. He just went to sleep, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just destroyed multiple lives in the span of minutes. When Alayna's parents woke up the next morning, they had no idea that their daughter was already dead. They had no idea that the friend they'd trusted, who was still in their home, had murdered their child just hours earlier. They went through their normal morning routine, probably thinking about breakfast, about plans for the day, about all the mundane details that make up family life. But when they went to check on Alayna, when they went to her bedroom to wake her up, they found her unresponsive. Their beautiful 5-year-old daughter, who had been fine when they tucked her in the night before, was lying motionless in her bed. Panic must have set in immediately. They called 911. They tried to revive her. They did everything parents do when faced with the unthinkable possibility that something is terribly, horribly wrong with their child. Emergency responders arrived and rushed Alayna to the hospital, but it was too late. There was nothing anyone could do. Alayna Jeanne was pronounced dead, and her parents were left with the unbearable reality that their little girl was gone. But at that moment, they still didn't know how she had died. They still didn't know that it wasn't a medical emergency or a tragic accident. They still didn't know that someone had killed their daughter. And they certainly didn't know that the person responsible was still in their home. Law enforcement began investigating immediately. When a 5-year-old child dies unexpectedly in her own bed, questions need to be answered. The medical examiner's office conducted an autopsy, and what they found confirmed everyone's worst fears. Alayna hadn't died of natural causes. She hadn't had some undiagnosed medical condition. She had been murdered. The evidence of sexual assault was undeniable. The cause of death was clear. This was a homicide, and someone needed to be held accountable. Investigators turned their attention to the people who had been in the home that night. They interviewed Alayna's parents, who were devastated, traumatized, and completely bewildered by what had happened. And they interviewed Zachary Todd Anderson, the family friend who had spent the night on their couch. Anderson initially denied any involvement. He played the role of the concerned friend, the shocked bystander who couldn't believe this terrible thing had happened. But investigators weren't buying it. They had forensic evidence. They had the timeline. They had the knowledge that Anderson had been in the home, that he had access to Alayna's bedroom, that he had opportunity and means. And then, faced with the mounting evidence against him, Anderson's story began to change. In what can only be described as a moment of either overwhelming guilt or recognition that he couldn't escape the physical evidence, Anderson confessed. He admitted to sexually assaulting Alayna. He admitted to suffocating her to stop her cries. He admitted to killing a 5-year-old child who had done nothing wrong except exist in the same house where he was a guest. Second call to action. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And if this case is impacting you the way it's impacting me, if you're feeling that mix of anger and heartbreak that comes from hearing about crimes against children, make sure you've hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Crimelab. These stories need to be told, and your support makes that possible. Continuing narrative. But here's where this case takes another dark turn, because Alayna's murder wasn't the end of the revelations about Zachary Todd Anderson. It was just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper into Anderson's background, as they looked into his history and his past behaviors, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. This wasn't the first time Anderson had targeted a child. This wasn't some isolated incident, some terrible mistake, some one-time lapse in judgment. This was part of a pattern that had been going on for years. Investigators discovered that Anderson had been collecting child sexual abuse material, commonly referred to as child pornography, for approximately 10 years. An entire decade. He had images and videos on his electronic devices that depicted the sexual abuse of children. He had been consuming this material, seeking it out, downloading it, organizing it, for 10 years before he murdered Alayna. Think about that timeline. Anderson would have been around 15 years old when he started collecting this material. 15. Still a teenager himself, but already developing a sexual interest in children that he was feeding and nurturing through the consumption of abuse material. And over the course of 10 years, that interest didn't diminish. It didn't go away. It escalated. It grew. Until finally, having access to a vulnerable 5-year-old child in the middle of the night, he acted on those urges in the most horrific way possible. This is something that's important to understand about cases like this. The consumption of child sexual abuse material isn't a victimless crime. It's not just looking at pictures. Every single image, every single video, represents a real child who was really abused. A child who was hurt, exploited, and traumatized to create that content. And studies have shown that individuals who consume this type of material are more likely to go on to commit hands-on offenses against children. Anderson is a perfect example of that progression. He started with images. He fed his attraction to children through those images for a decade. And then he escalated to direct assault and murder. The community that had already been reeling from Alayna's death was now faced with the additional horror of knowing that Anderson had been a predator hiding among them for years. How many times had he been around their children? How many community events, softball games, backyard barbecues, casual gatherings had Anderson attended where children were present? How many parents had unknowingly allowed their kids to be in the presence of someone who was sexually attracted to children and had been actively feeding that attraction for a decade? These are the questions that haunt small communities when something like this happens. Because it's not just about the one victim, as horrific as that is. It's about the shattering of trust, the second-guessing of every interaction, the fear that maybe there were other victims who haven't come forward, the worry that maybe your own child was at risk and you just didn't know it. Law enforcement conducted a thorough investigation into Anderson's background, looking for any indication that there might be other victims. They examined his devices, his communications, his movements over the years. While they found the extensive collection of child sexual abuse material, they did not find evidence of additional hands-on victims beyond Alayna. But that doesn't mean there weren't other children who felt uncomfortable around Anderson, who had moments where something felt off, who might have been groomed or targeted but escaped before anything happened. It just means that investigators couldn't find prosecutable evidence of additional assaults. The legal proceedings that followed Alayna's death moved relatively quickly by the standards of the criminal justice system. Anderson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder while committing criminal sexual conduct. Under Minnesota law, this is one of the most serious charges that can be brought. First-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. There's no negotiation. There's no possibility of early release. It's a life sentence, period. But Anderson was also charged with multiple counts related to the possession of child sexual abuse material. Each image, each video, each piece of evidence of his decade-long consumption of this material, represented additional charges that could be brought against him. Prosecutors wanted to make sure that even if something went wrong with the murder case, even if some technicality or legal issue arose, Anderson would still be held accountable for his crimes against children. Anderson's defense team had very little to work with. Their client had confessed. The physical evidence supported that confession. The autopsy results were clear. There was no question about what had happened, only about what punishment Anderson would face. In cases like this, where the evidence is overwhelming and a confession exists, defense attorneys often focus on trying to negotiate a plea deal that might avoid the death penalty in states where that's a possibility, or that might result in concurrent rather than consecutive sentences when multiple charges are involved. But in Minnesota, the death penalty isn't an option. It was abolished in the state back in 1911. So the question wasn't whether Anderson might face execution. The question was whether he would be sentenced to life without parole on the murder charge, and how much additional time might be added for the child sexual abuse material charges. On January 19, 2017, less than 5 months after Alayna's death, Zachary Todd Anderson appeared in court to be sentenced. Alayna's family was there. Members of the community were there. People who needed to see justice done, who needed to see this man held accountable for what he had done, filled the courtroom. The judge sentenced Anderson to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Alayna Jeanne. This meant that Anderson, who was 25 years old at the time, would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. He would never be eligible for parole. He would never have a chance at freedom. He would grow old and die in prison, which is exactly what he deserved for taking the life of a 5-year-old child. But the judge didn't stop there. Anderson was also sentenced to additional time for the possession of child sexual abuse material. While these sentences would run concurrent with the life sentence, meaning they wouldn't add additional years beyond the life term, they served an important purpose. They put on the public record that Anderson wasn't just a murderer. He was a predator who had been targeting children for years. They ensured that anyone who looked up his case in the future would see the full scope of his crimes. In his statement to the court, Anderson reportedly expressed remorse for what he had done. He apologized to Alayna's family. He said he wished he could take it back, that he was sorry, that he knew nothing he could say would make it better. But words are cheap, especially when they come after you've been caught, after you've confessed, after you have no other options left. True remorse would have been stopping himself before he went into Alayna's bedroom. True remorse would have been turning himself in immediately after realizing what he had done. True remorse would have been thinking about the harm he was causing when he was downloading child sexual abuse material for 10 years. Instead, Anderson's apology rang hollow to those who had loved Alayna, to those who had to live with the consequences of his actions every single day while he sat in a prison cell with 3 meals a day and a roof over his head, which is more than Alayna would ever have again. Alayna's family faced the impossible task of moving forward after losing their daughter in such a horrific way. How do you go on with your life when your 5-year-old child has been murdered by someone you trusted? How do you sleep at night knowing that you invited the person who killed your daughter into your home? How do you forgive yourself, even though you did nothing wrong, even though you had no way of knowing, even though any reasonable person would have made the same choices you made? The guilt that parents feel in situations like this is profound and often irrational. Alayna's parents did everything right. They were responsible about not letting someone who had been drinking drive home. They trusted someone who had given them no reason not to trust him. They went to sleep believing their daughter was safe in her own home. But the what-ifs must have been overwhelming. What if they hadn't invited Anderson to stay that night? What if they had checked on Alayna one more time? What if they had somehow sensed that something was wrong? But the truth is, the only person responsible for Alayna's death is Zachary Todd Anderson. Not her parents. Not the community that had welcomed him. Not the people who played softball with him or worked with him or had drinks with him. Anderson made the choice to assault Alayna. Anderson made the choice to suffocate her when she cried out. Anderson made the choice to prioritize his own twisted desires over the life of an innocent child. The blame lies with him and him alone. In the aftermath of Alayna's death, her family made a decision that speaks to incredible strength and resilience. Rather than allowing Alayna's story to be defined solely by the horrible way she died, they chose to celebrate the beautiful 5 years she had lived. They established ways to honor her memory, to keep her spirit alive, to ensure that when people heard the name Alayna Jeanne, they didn't just think about her murder but about the joy she brought to the world during her short time in it. The family created opportunities for the community to support them and to remember Alayna. They organized events, they shared stories, they kept her memory alive in ways that focused on love rather than violence. This is something that many families of murder victims struggle with. How do you honor your loved one without that honor being overshadowed by the circumstances of their death? How do you make sure people remember the person, not just the crime? Alayna's family found ways to do that. They talked about her love of Frozen, her favorite pink Princess Elsa blanket, the way she laughed, the things that made her unique and special. They made sure that people knew Alayna as more than just a victim. She was a daughter. She was a little girl with dreams and hopes and a whole life ahead of her that was stolen by someone who should have protected her. The small Minnesota town where this tragedy occurred also had to grapple with the aftermath. In a community of just 1,000 people, everyone knew Alayna's family. Everyone knew Zachary Anderson. The degrees of separation were so small that nearly everyone in town had some personal connection to this case. Maybe they had worked with Anderson. Maybe their kids had played with Alayna. Maybe they had been at that bar the night Anderson was drinking with Alayna's parents. Maybe they had seen them at the softball games on Friday nights. The collective trauma that a community experiences after something like this is real and profound. It changes the way people think about safety. It changes the way they think about trust. Parents become more protective of their children. People second-guess their instincts. The small-town feeling of knowing everyone and trusting your neighbors gets replaced with suspicion and fear. And that loss of innocence, that loss of the ability to trust freely, is yet another way that Anderson's crimes hurt people beyond just Alayna and her immediate family. Communities like this one often come together in the aftermath of tragedy, and by all accounts, that's what happened here. People rallied around Alayna's family. They provided support, whether that was financial help, emotional support, or simply being present and bearing witness to the family's grief. The community had already proven its resilience in the face of the tornado that had struck months earlier. Now they had to prove it again in the face of an even more devastating tragedy. There were vigils held for Alayna where community members gathered to remember her, to light candles, to share their grief collectively. These events serve important purposes. They allow people to feel like they're doing something, even when there's nothing that can really be done. They create space for communal mourning. They remind families like Alayna's that they're not alone in their grief, that the whole community is standing with them. And perhaps most importantly, they send a message that crimes like this, predators like Anderson, will not define who they are as a community. Yes, this horrible thing happened. Yes, they will carry the scars forever. But they will also carry Alayna's memory, and they will not let fear and darkness be the only legacy of what occurred on August 20, 2016. The question of how to prevent tragedies like this is one that haunts parents, educators, law enforcement, and communities everywhere. The reality is that most child sexual abuse is committed by someone the child knows and trusts. Stranger danger, while real, represents a much smaller percentage of actual abuse cases. The vast majority of children who are sexually abused are victimized by family members, family friends, coaches, teachers, religious leaders, or other trusted adults in their lives. This creates a terrible paradox for parents. You want your children to trust adults. You want them to have relationships with extended family, with friends of the family, with mentors and role models. You want them to grow up in a community where they feel safe and supported. But you also need to protect them from the small percentage of adults who will exploit that trust. So what can parents do? Experts recommend several strategies. First, teach children the proper names for their body parts and make it clear that certain parts are private. This gives children the language they need to report if something inappropriate happens. Second, establish that no one, not even trusted adults, should be asking them to keep secrets from their parents, especially secrets about touching or physical contact. Third, pay attention to changes in behavior. Children who are being abused often can't articulate what's happening to them, but they may show signs through nightmares, regression in behavior, fear of certain people or places, or age-inappropriate sexual knowledge. Fourth, and this is perhaps the hardest one, parents need to trust their instincts. If something feels off about an adult's interaction with your child, if someone seems too interested in being alone with your child, if someone is constantly pushing boundaries or trying to get special access, listen to that feeling. It's better to offend someone by being overprotective than to ignore your instincts and have something terrible happen. But even with all of these precautions, the reality is that predators like Anderson are often very skilled at hiding their true nature. They know how to present themselves as trustworthy. They know how to integrate themselves into communities and families. They know how to groom not just the children they target but also the adults around those children, building trust and access over time. Anderson had been part of Alayna's father's social circle. He was a co-worker. He was a teammate. He had been to their home multiple times without incident. Alayna's parents had no way of knowing that Anderson had been collecting child sexual abuse material for 10 years. He wasn't a registered sex offender. He hadn't been caught or charged with anything before. By all outward appearances, he was just a normal 25-year-old guy who liked softball and hanging out with his buddies. This is what makes cases like this so terrifying. Because if Alayna's parents, who by all accounts were loving and attentive, couldn't spot the warning signs, if a community of 1,000 people where everyone knows everyone couldn't identify the predator in their midst, then how is any parent supposed to feel confident in their ability to protect their children? The answer is that there is no perfect protection. There is no foolproof system. There is no way to eliminate all risk while still allowing children to live normal lives and develop normal relationships with the adults around them. All parents can do is be vigilant, be informed, teach their children about body safety and consent, and create an environment where children feel comfortable reporting if something inappropriate happens. And communities need to take these crimes seriously when they do occur. They need to support victims and their families. They need to hold perpetrators accountable. And they need to have difficult conversations about the reality of child sexual abuse, even when those conversations are uncomfortable. One of the positive developments in recent years has been increased awareness of the link between consumption of child sexual abuse material and hands-on offenses. For a long time, there was a belief in some circles that people who viewed this material were somehow different from people who would actually assault a child in person. That viewing images was a way of satisfying urges without actually harming anyone. But research has thoroughly debunked this idea. First, as mentioned earlier, every image represents a real child who was really abused. The creation of the material involves actual harm to actual children. Second, studies have shown that a significant percentage of people who consume child sexual abuse material do go on to commit hands-on offenses. The material doesn't satisfy their urges. It feeds them. It normalizes the sexualization of children in their minds. It desensitizes them to the harm. And it can escalate their desires until viewing images is no longer enough. Anderson is a textbook example of this progression. He started viewing material when he was approximately 15 years old. For 10 years, he consumed this content, surrounding himself with images and videos that normalized the sexual abuse of children. And then, when presented with an opportunity to act on those urges, when he had access to a vulnerable 5-year-old child in the middle of the night, he did exactly what the research suggests people like him are at risk of doing. He escalated from viewing abuse to committing it. This is why law enforcement takes possession of child sexual abuse material so seriously. It's not just about the images themselves, although those represent real victims who deserve justice. It's also about identifying individuals who are at high risk of committing hands-on offenses before they have the chance to hurt a child. Every person arrested for possession is potentially a person who was stopped before they could create a victim like Alayna. Of course, in Anderson's case, that intervention came too late. He had been collecting material for a decade without being caught. He had progressed to the point where he was ready to act on his urges. And a 5-year-old girl paid the ultimate price for society's failure to identify him as a threat before he had the opportunity to hurt her. The investigation into Anderson's electronic devices after his arrest revealed the extent of his collection. Hundreds of images. Videos. Material depicting children of various ages being sexually abused. Each one of those images represented a child somewhere in the world who had been hurt to create that content. Each one represented a crime. Each one represented a failure of adults to protect a vulnerable child. Investigators who work on these types of cases often struggle with the psychological toll of viewing such material. They have to look at these images to build cases, to identify victims, to track down perpetrators. And the things they see stay with them. Many investigators who work in crimes against children units require regular psychological support to process the trauma of what they're exposed to in the course of their work. But they do this difficult, traumatic work because it matters. Because every perpetrator they catch is potentially preventing future victims. Because every child they identify in abuse material is a child who might be rescued from ongoing abuse. Because someone has to stand up for the children who can't protect themselves. In Alayna's case, the investigators who worked her murder did everything right. They collected evidence. They followed leads. They built a case that resulted in a confession and a life sentence. They ensured that Anderson would never have the opportunity to hurt another child. But I'm sure that doesn't make it any easier for them to think about what happened to Alayna. I'm sure they still carry the weight of that case, the image of a 5-year-old girl in her Princess Elsa blanket, the knowledge of what was done to her by someone who should have protected her. As time has passed since Alayna's death, her family has continued to honor her memory. They've continued to advocate for awareness of child safety. They've continued to speak her name and share her story, not because they want to relive the trauma but because they want other families to learn from their experience. They want other parents to understand that predators don't always look like strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes they look like your friend from work. Sometimes they look like the guy you play softball with every Friday. Sometimes they look exactly like someone you would trust. The legacy that Elena's family has worked to create is one of awareness and prevention. They want other parents to have conversations with their children about body safety. They want communities to take these threats seriously. They want people to understand that child sexual abuse is far more common than most want to believe, and that the perpetrators are far more likely to be someone you know than someone you don't. And they want Alayna to be remembered not just as a victim but as a little girl who loved Frozen, who had a favorite pink blanket, who had 5 beautiful years of life before it was stolen from her. They want her humanity to be centered in her story, not just the horror of how she died. This is something that's important in how we talk about cases like this. Yes, the details of the crime are important. Yes, people need to understand what happened so they can recognize warning signs and protect their own children. But the victims of these crimes were people, not just statistics. They had personalities and preferences and things that made them smile. They had families who loved them and futures that were stolen. And when we tell their stories, we owe it to them and to their families to remember that. Alayna Jeanne was 5 years old. She liked Frozen. She had a pink Princess Elsa blanket. She trusted the adults around her to keep her safe. And one of those adults betrayed that trust in the most horrific way possible. She deserved so much better than what happened to her. She deserved to grow up, to go to school, to make friends, to have adventures, to become whoever she was meant to become. All of that was taken from her by Zachary Todd Anderson's selfish, evil choices. Anderson is now serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his days in prison, which is where he belongs. He will never hurt another child. He will never have the opportunity to act on his twisted desires again. He will grow old behind bars, forgotten by everyone except the people whose lives he destroyed. But even his imprisonment doesn't undo what he did. It doesn't bring Alayna back. It doesn't give her family closure, because there is no closure when you lose a child to murder. It doesn't make the community feel completely safe again. It doesn't answer all the questions about how this could have happened, how he could have hidden his true nature for so long, how no one saw the warning signs. What it does do is provide a measure of justice. It ensures accountability. It sends a message that crimes against children will be punished to the fullest extent of the law. And it prevents Anderson from ever having the opportunity to hurt another child, which is perhaps the most important thing of all. The small Minnesota town where this tragedy occurred has continued to heal and move forward, though the scars remain. They rebuilt after the tornado. They supported each other after Alayna's death. They proved that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, communities can come together and find strength in each other. But they also learned hard lessons about trust, about safety, about the reality that evil can hide behind a friendly face. Parents in that community, and in communities everywhere, have to navigate the difficult balance between letting their children experience life and keeping them safe from harm. They have to teach their children about dangers without terrifying them. They have to allow their children to form relationships with adults while also monitoring those relationships for warning signs. They have to trust people while also maintaining a healthy level of vigilance. It's an impossible standard, really. Because if you're too trusting, you risk what happened to Alayna. But if you're too suspicious, you risk raising children who are fearful and unable to form healthy relationships. There's no perfect answer. There's no formula that guarantees safety while also allowing children to thrive. All parents can do is educate themselves, educate their children, stay involved in their children's lives, and create an environment where children feel comfortable reporting if something inappropriate happens. And even then, even with all the right precautions, bad things can still happen because we live in a world where people like Zachary Todd Anderson exist. But we also live in a world where communities rally around grieving families. Where investigators work tirelessly to bring perpetrators to justice. Where families like Elena's turn their grief into advocacy. Where people refuse to let fear and darkness win. And that's something worth remembering too. Elena's story is tragic. It's horrifying. It's the kind of thing that makes you want to pull your children close and never let them out of your sight. But it's also a story about a community that refused to be broken. About a family that found ways to honor their daughter's memory. About a justice system that held a predator accountable. About people who decided that they wouldn't let this one terrible act define who they were or how they lived their lives. The question that this case poses, the question of how you know when to trust somebody, doesn't have a simple answer. You can't always know. You can't see into people's hearts or minds. You can't predict who might hurt your child. All you can do is be aware, be vigilant, be involved, and be willing to have difficult conversations. You can teach your children that their bodies belong to them and that no one has the right to touch them inappropriately. You can teach them that they should never keep secrets from you about touching or physical contact. You can pay attention to the adults in your children's lives and trust your instincts if something feels off. You can limit situations where adults have unsupervised access to your children. You can check sex offender registries before allowing your children to spend time at friends' houses or with new adults in their lives. But even with all of that, you can't eliminate all risk. And that's terrifying for any parent to accept. The reality is that we can't protect our children from everything. We can only do our best, stay informed, stay involved, and hope that it's enough. In Elena's case, her parents did everything that reasonable parents would do. They trusted someone who had given them no reason not to trust him. They made a responsible decision about not letting someone who had been drinking drive home. They had no way of knowing what would happen. The fault lies entirely with Anderson, not with them. But I'm sure that knowledge doesn't make their grief any easier to bear. As we look at this case years after it happened, the lessons remain relevant. Child predators exist. They often hide in plain sight. They often target children they have access to through family relationships or community connections. They groom not just the children they target but also the adults around those children. And they escalate over time, often starting with consumption of abuse material before moving on to hands-on offenses. These are uncomfortable truths. But they're truths that every parent, every educator, every community member needs to understand. Because awareness is the first step in protection. Understanding how predators operate, what warning signs to look for, and how to have conversations with children about safety can make a difference. Will it prevent every tragedy? No. There will always be cases like Elena's that break through even the best defenses. But if awareness and education can prevent even one child from being victimized, if it can help even one parent spot warning signs before something terrible happens, if it can empower even one child to speak up about inappropriate behavior, then it's worth the discomfort of these conversations. Alayna Jeanne Ertl's life mattered. Her death matters. Her story matters. Not because of the sensational details of her murder, but because she was a real child with a real family who loved her. Because what happened to her could happen to any child. Because the person who hurt her was someone who seemed normal, trustworthy, safe. Because her family's experience can teach other families to be vigilant without being paranoid, to be aware without living in fear. The 5 years that Alayna lived were filled with love. She was cherished by her parents. She had toys and blankets that she loved. She had a childhood, even if it was cut far too short. And in the years since her death, her family has worked to make sure that those 5 years of joy are remembered alongside the tragedy of how she died. That's the legacy they're building for her. Not just a cautionary tale, though her story certainly serves that purpose. But a celebration of a little girl who brought light into the world for 5 years. A reminder that every child deserves to be protected, valued, and allowed to grow up in safety. A call to action for communities to take these threats seriously and to support families who are working to keep their children safe. Zachary Todd Anderson took Alayna's life. He took her future. He took all the things she might have become, all the experiences she might have had, all the joy she might have brought to the world. But he didn't take her memory. He didn't take the love her family has for her. He didn't take the impact her story can have on other families who hear it and take steps to protect their own children. In that sense, Alayna's legacy continues, even though her life was stolen. Third call to action. Alayna's story is one that every parent needs to hear. It's a story about trust, about betrayal, about the devastating consequences when predators hide in plain sight. If this case has affected you, if you believe these stories need to be told so that other families can learn and protect their children, I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that subscribe button to Cold Case Crimelab so you never miss a case that deserves attention. Second, drop a like on this video to help the algorithm share Alayna's story with more people who need to hear it. And third, comment below. Tell me what you think about this case. Share your thoughts on how communities can better protect children. Let me know what cases you want me to cover next. Your engagement isn't just numbers. It's how we keep these victims' stories alive. It's how we honor their memory. It's how we make sure that their deaths weren't in vain. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to Alayna's story. And thank you for caring enough to want to make a difference. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and never stop fighting for justice.